right, so you guys know that we are paired up with flatbooks.com, and we just want to take some time to remind you that if you're looking for practical, flexible resources for your music classroom, you've got to head over to flatbooks.com, that's flat-books.com, and check out all of their innovative ebooks and lesson plans that can be used in your classroom today. It's so cool. You download them right to your computer, and you can start using them immediately. And just for listening to the podcast, if you use the code Musicast20, that's MUSICAST20 at checkout, you'll receive 20% off your entire purchase.
Alrighty, welcome folks. Thanks for joining us again for another episode. With us today or tonight, depending on when you're listening, is Dr. Chris Azzara. Thank you very much for being here, Dr. Azzara. And one of the things we were trying to do, we're kind of like upstarting. We appreciate that you're one of our first few to chat with, and we learned that you have some nice ties to Marissa. I learned in conversation with Marissa that we have some indirect ties as well. But for listeners, since you're the expert on you, why don't you, would you be able to give us a little bit of your background in terms of you as a student, musician, and just a teacher?
Sure. Well, thanks again for inviting me to do this. It's a pleasure to be here to talk with you. And I guess I would say that the first part of my life, I grew up in Virginia. I was actually born in the very southern part of Virginia, Marion, Virginia, but when I was 4, my family moved to northern Virginia. So I spent from age 4 till my mid-20s in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is a suburb of the D.C. area. And I started sort of playing piano, doing freelance gigs when I was in high school. I was able to play with a lot of the military musicians that are in that area, really high-level musicians that are terrific people. And I started to do that in high school and then continued to stick around that area to play and to go to undergraduate school at George Mason University, which is a state school in Virginia. And so while I was getting my bachelor's degree, I was playing piano and living in that area. That's where all my family is. And at that time, everybody was living there. Now we've all kind of moved to different parts of the country. But after graduating from George Mason, I started teaching in Fairfax County Public Schools. And my first job was teaching at the high school where I went to high school. So that was pretty interesting to have that happen. And after teaching there for a while, all the while I started to compare the kinds of things that I was doing as a teacher and the kinds of things I was doing as a musician, as an improvising musician, because as a person playing in that area, I was playing mostly jazz music with small groups and big bands, but also freelancing, doing casuals and events and parties and things like that. And so that required that I improvise and I do things like write arrangements and do more creative things, play in different keys for different singers and such. And I was also comparing that to the teaching that I was doing. And Fairfax County has terrific music programs. If you're not aware of that, it's a terrific place for music. But I also wanted to do more growing myself, so I decided to go to graduate school. And so I went to the Eastman School of Music in the summer of 1985, and started as a summers only student. Marissa and I have that in common. And after being there, I realized that I really wanted to take a deep dive into understanding how we learn to improvise music, how creativity can be a central part of the teaching and learning of music. During that first summer, I met Richard Grunow, Bill Dobbins, and Rayburn Wright. Rayburn Wright and Bill Dobbins are in the jazz department, and Richard Grunow obviously was in the music teaching and learning, or at that time it was called music education department. And it really was a place where I felt like I could grow and develop as both a teacher and a musician. So I stuck around and I continued at Eastman and went full-time for my PhD. After that, I moved to Connecticut and taught at the Hart School of Music for 11 years. And then in 2002, I returned to Eastman as a faculty member. And my responsibilities include those things in the music teaching and learning department. I'm also an affiliate faculty member in the jazz studies and contemporary media department at Eastman. So it makes sense that I would be doing that now, considering my background.
So I have a question, and maybe I just made an assumption, but I've always known you as a jazzer. Were you educated to be a jazzer, or was that out of necessity when you started gigging?
My whole life, I've always had a connection to jazz music, and my first piano lessons happened more informally at home with my dad, who played in the same trio for 25 years with these other two men that were terrific musicians. And I always wanted to play jazz music, more popular styles. My first formal lessons in piano, like most people who take piano lessons, were what you might call classical lessons.
Okay.
And I was working on my jazz skills as a part of that, but primarily I started to realize that music is music, and the classical music was informing a lot of my jazz playing. I met, when I was about 15 or 16, I met this gentleman who was a staff arranger for the Army Band and who was a great jazz pianist. Mm-hmm. So I had two teachers at one point. And then I found another teacher who was a musician in that area. So at one point I had a jazz teacher and an arranging teacher and a classical teacher. All three things that I like to do now: play jazz, piano, and arrange music. But I had three teachers, and eventually started to put that together into some kind of a composite idea of what I sound like. But that's how I grew up, all the while wanting to play jazz music from the very beginning.
I love the idea of music as music, and it seems like such a standard concept, but as a high school director, I'm guilty of it just as much. You get to a certain point where sometimes you can't help but you're teaching, sometimes you fall into windows of what season it is. If it's marching band season, I'm approaching certain things to directly influence marching band season. And then when jazz starts, I do jazz, and that kind of just blend, and that marriage just would make more sense. And sometimes it's just easier to file in the boxes. But when you found yourself with all these different teachers, did you find it influencing your own teaching, or how you approach things?
Yeah, it was quite inspiring to not only have the formal lessons of those teachers, but I had some informal folks that I was gigging with who took me under their wing when I was younger, taught me the importance of hearing chord changes and different tunes. And I'm talking about people that were already more established when I was in high school, and then just keeping those relationships alive. That was an inspiration. And I thought to myself, after I had been teaching in the public schools and performing this way, I think we can help students learn to improvise. It can be taught. And that was the inspiration to go to graduate school and develop the curriculums that ultimately are what I do today. The germs for what I'm doing now it started it happening back in those days. Yeah.
And we couldn't have planned it better. That's a perfect kind of dovetail and shift. But the next question that we had for you was, your work that you're very well known for at this point is based in music learning theory. And give a brief little idea of the elevator pitch of what that is, and also why do you find that such an attractive teaching method?
Right. I got introduced to music learning theory because Dick Grunow, his friends call him Dick Grunow, so if I slip into saying that, but in his professional life, he's known as Richard Grunow, was writing a curriculum that's referred to as Jump Right In, the instrumental series. And a lot of what he was talking about in a class that I was taking with him resonated with my curiosity. Because back in 1985, in instrumental music, again, I was a high school band director, and then I was a middle school band director while I was going to school in the summers. So back in those days, if you were thinking about improvisation in school, it was happening in general music sometimes, many times, but that's where you might find it, not all the time. And it was happening in some jazz ensembles, but even in jazz, people would have jazz bands, but they wouldn't necessarily have their head around how to improvise. And I was thinking, I'm learning not only from Bill Dobbins in my jazz studies and my Rayburn Wright, I studied with him, but Richard Grunow provided this curriculum that said, yes, we want to make playing by ear something that's central to learning. And one of the reasons I think I became a co-author is because I kept making suggestions about the fact that, yeah, well, improvisation is something that people should be learning to do as well. And I suppose in my persistence, I started to get involved on a level of being an author of some of the materials. At first, I was playing piano on a lot of the recordings that Richard Grunow was making. And in collaboration with Ed Gordon at the time, they were starting just the very beginnings of the instrumental series. And what started to happen was, as I took courses and started to get to know music learning theory, I realized that what it really is a scaffolding or a model for how we learn when we learn music. And it's not really one specific approach to teaching. It's more of a description of learning that would inform your teaching. And I liked that because it was saying things like, start with the ears. This is an oral art. So let's listen and sing and move and make that the foundation of our learning. Which a lot of people have said. It's not just music learning theory that says that. A lot of important pedagogues have said that. A lot of musicians understand that. Although in practice, I know as a high school band director, it was something that I wasn't thinking enough about. So my own personal journey, that was an insight that I gained. But then the music learning theory, I suppose what you could say is that it sort of provides this model that says that after we think about learning by ear, there are ways that we can scaffold the learning by naming things and by creating things and then reading things and then writing things. And sometimes I think about it as common sense. And when I speak to my jazz musician friends or anybody who's sort of introduced to the work that I'm doing, I say listening is a place to start, and creating and improvising and listening, they need each other, and that spins into reading and composing. And then analysis, the theory of all of that, is got to be contextual. There's got to be context for theory, and that brings us back to the vocabularies of listening and improvising and reading and writing. So I think it was that aspect of it that was attractive to me as a musician and as a teacher who has a lot of feelings, a lot of passion for helping folks develop some skills with their oral skill, their improvising skill, their reading skill, reading with real depth and meaning, and taking some time to write some music and having what I might refer to as a comprehensive curriculum, because that's what, now when I'm working with Dick Grunow on these materials, what we're really trying to create is a comprehensive curriculum so that people grow up learning music in a way that completes the whole picture of what it might mean to be a musician.
And sorry, Maris.
I was just going to say, one of the things that I think you were the first person for me when I took your class, you drew the analogy of, well, if we don't teach students to create, it's almost like we never taught them to write in English class. You drew that parallel. And for me in my career, that's what really made it click. Like, wow, we're truly not giving them a complete education if we don't include this. And then as I started incorporating it into my classroom, I ran into advocacy concerns, administrators or other teachers that, why are you doing this? You're wasting your time. This, you're never going to perform this stuff, whatever. And I would use that analogy and they would go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And so I love that whole concept. I think it's powerful. Marissa, it's a very good way to get to the heart of what I'm really the most concerned about. If you zoom out of human learning into the big picture, many times musicians are taught, or students are taught music in a way that doesn't invite them to speak the language that they're reading. Right.
And that's a concern for me in general. We need to be able to express our thoughts. It's not enough just to pronounce what we are reading. And that's really the attraction. And I think I started to realize that, well, people have been saying this for many hundreds of years. I can reference Socrates, or I can reference great musicians like Hummel, or there's just throughout history, people have commented about this. And it seems like in the West, we're more preoccupied with that. There are many cultures throughout the world that are oral traditions. They're not so preoccupied with reading, frankly. And we need to learn from them. At the same time, we have to remember that it is an oral art and that we need to learn to speak the language that we're reading so that we can have these meaningful interactions. I often wonder why I'm so passionate about it, and I think you hit the nail on the head. I guess I'll use the word dangerous. It's dangerous to pronounce something you're reading and really not know what it means through the creative process of speaking. And then the difference between improvising and composition is more temporal. In improvisation, you're spontaneously interacting like we are now. And then in composition or writing, you can reflect and travel through time to revise. And it's a time to reflect. So is reading. Reading can be a time to reflect as well. So I think you're also, Marissa, really getting to the heart of what attracted me so much to the work that started for me back in 1985. I didn't become an author, though, until 1991, I think it is.
Okay.
So it took some time to evolve into, publications and things, but that evolution involved a lot of growth on my part as well. I learned a lot at Eastman. I learned a lot as a person. And the whole spirit of trying to help people bring their musicianship to teaching. Sure. I like to think about education it comes from the Latin word to lead out. And so good teachers are able to wake up the gifts that are inside of people and bring them out. And as musicians, we can do that musically.
I remember, and I can't remember if it was my freshman, my sophomore, or junior year, but when you had come to Duquesne, I have vivid memories of sitting kind of in the choir room, spread out, having these conversational 3-note patterns passing back and forth. And I had phenomenal teachers through middle school, high school, and I understood the idea of music. But it was one of those times that I understood the concept of tension and release and dominant and tonic, but it was one of the first times that I could really remember the experience being had right there, being reliant on my understanding of how these things related and having to express them on my own, because I always could hide in it was already written on the page. So I understood it, but I kind of understood it in quotations rather than this experience is dependent on it. And it's interesting because it really did kind of make us ask the questions of why is this something that took until sophomore year to really feel this way? And it so changes how you approach it in that way.
Well, that's another interesting thing about the whole learning process, that if you want to learn a lot about learning, we need to pay attention to early childhood. Most artists are trying to remember what they already knew in early childhood. And what I mean by that is the idea of being present and in the moment and being expressive in that way. I like how you put that too, because this idea of autonomy and mastery and relatedness, the idea that you have something to say and let's interact with that. So I think another 4 dimensions, we talked about the listening, the improvising, the reading, the composing, and theory and analysis would have that as a context. Another thing I like to share with people is this idea of the importance of interactions, grouping. In music, it would be the sounds that we hear, the rhythm and the harmonic and expressive stylistic sounds into meaningful chunks. In language, we do it with the different sounds of language that get grouped into morphs and words and sentences and phrases. And in music, those become patterns and phrases and pieces, and what the stories of music are the repertoire that we know, right? So you've got this interaction, this grouping. Artists reuse materials, so you want to pay attention to how, now that it's art, you'll hear some repetition and unity and variety. And you'll also learn how to speak that, hopefully. And then that would bring us to this idea of comparing, is something the same or not the same? And the idea of having some anticipation. In language, an analogy in language would be, as you're listening to me, you know the next word that I'm going to say. And in music, there's a similar kind of, if I sing a phrase like, duh, 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 and then you could predict or anticipate, duh. So there's a lot of analogies. The only reason the analogies work is because people speak English or they speak a language. But there are differences between music and language, but the reason the analogies work is because we learn by ear when we speak a language, and it's a good thing to think about for learning by ear when we learn music.
I have, and there's so many different spots they can do it, but my students start in ninth grade, and when they first come, I know I don't do enough improvisation and things like that in the class, but one other thing I try and do as best as I can is talk about tonal tendencies and just these relationships and how they feel. And the one that always gets them is you tell them to go home, and I say, it doesn't matter if it's anyone's birthday, it doesn't matter anything. At the dinner table, just sing and go, happy birthday to, and stop. And just watch what happens. And when they have that moment of, they go, but you didn't finish it. And I said, I'm not going to finish it. And you always hear someone somewhere just goes, and then they like just settle it. And you could see everyone in the room go, oh, good. Finally, it's done. But like, that's the first moment that I feel like I have them. So I start to talk about these ideas and they're kind of with me, but they're like, nah, let's just play something. And that's the first time you really have them feel it. And, it opens their eyes to it a little bit, which is really cool.
Yeah, I love the idea of feeling it, feeling harmony, feeling rhythm, understanding style in that context, and having some technique. In our materials, we call them executive skills, but the actual playing technique or the singing technique to execute all the ideas that you have. I think that's a really impressive way to summarize the feeling that you're talking about.
Go ahead, Mitch.
I was going to ask a next question, so if you have
actually was too, so you can go and we'll see if it was the same one.
Okay, so both of us are high school teachers, and I know when I came to Eastman and took your classes and had some mentors doing similar things, it really redefined the way I looked at teaching and how I chose what material to present to my students. However, I'm at the top of the pyramid. I'm at the high school level. So if students are just getting this for the first time, if they're getting improvisation and learning how to do all of these things 5 years, 6 years into their learning experience, what's the most effective way to get them going on something like this? Is there a most effective way to do something like that?
Yeah, that's really, really important. Well, it's interesting because it's never too late to start any kind of thing from the beginning. It's always good to be a beginner. And I think that students have had experiences that we could recognize that are improvisational that maybe they didn't even think of as improvisational. But the most important thing, I think, is to go from where they are and to learn what their strengths are. There may be some gaps, there may be some things they haven't experienced, and to think of it that way, where they do have something to say already, rather than starting over or anything. Let's say they can read really well. Let's say they have a relationship with notation. You keep that obviously as a part of what they're doing while you help them realize, oh, I could help to improve this understanding and deepen my awareness for music. So I like to think about it no matter what age group. So to answer your question, I could answer the same question for somebody who is just starting out. But right. to still answer your question and answer it in the context of how I might help somebody is I would start with repertoire. And a lot of the developing musicianship through improvisation curriculum that I've written uses these 6 elements, these 6 components that no matter what level you are experiencing music, it will help you to think about how this can be done. So take, for example, a piece of music that somebody is learning or a piece of music that they might enjoy learning by ear. Or even if they're reading it, you would have them sing and do things that aren't on the page. Let's say the melody is on the page, you could have them learn the bass line. Because part of learning repertoire is learning the melody, the bass line, because the bass line will outline the harmonic progression and help them pay attention to some of the rhythmic cohesiveness. Take any tune and start thinking about, well, what's going on with the rhythm patterns and the idea of how what we're playing has some cohesiveness because of the rhythm. As you start to think about that, you start to develop your vocabulary. So that's the second thing I would ask people to think about is, based on the repertoire you're learning, can you be inspired to understand the vocabulary? So let's say, well, you could pick a tune that I like to use. I just sang a little bit of Joshua, which is a spiritual that I use for folks. And you could be somebody who's young starting out doing this, or you could be a professional musician who hasn't improvised very much learning a song like Joshua because it's such a great tune. And it's pendular. Pendular meaning that it's either got this harmony that's here, like dun, dun, dun. It's either tonic or dominant, right? But I, even before naming it, I sang it for you. But you have this do 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 da 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 ba da 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 do 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 da 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 do da 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 do da. Now the song is longer than that, but that excerpt of the song can help explain what I'm describing. And I've heard there are recordings of Herbie Hancock doing that tune, Grant Green. That's a song that can be something that professionals could play, or it's something that somebody who's young, who's just starting out, could play, right? So if they're in high school, that'd be a very attractive tune for a high school student or a middle school student. So the idea would be that, what's the vocabulary? What do I mean by that? The repertoire is this tune. Vocabulary, well, rhythmically, the cohesive part, ba 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 ba, that gets reused, ba 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 ba, then the beginning again. Ba 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 ba. There it is again, and then it cadences at the end there. Ba 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 ba. So let's make one of those ourselves. Let's create our own rhythm pattern and repeat it this way and do it this way and cadence that way. Harmonically, it's in minor, 2 chords, bum bum bum, and playing around with that. And if you zoom way out to the bass line, you get those notes. If you zoom into the middle ground, you get, if you zoom out just a bit, you get do, do, do. And then you get do, do. And then you're back, do, do. So there's a way we can help students navigate those harmonic groupings. That's what I mean by vocabulary. The third element would be to help people learn to better trust their intuition, meaning singing things that come from within without thinking about too much analysis yet. The fourth part would be for people to think about, how can I organize my learning and structure it in a way where if I provide myself these limits, I can think about being creative with those elements. Stravinsky said that if he could give himself limits, he could be more creative. So I like to help people in the beginning come up with some of these limits. And the limits have to be true to the repertoire. So for example, I have these 7 skills that I've developed. The first skill is to take the roots of the chords and invent a nice rhythm pattern that you reuse on the roots of the chords, and see how inventive you can be with that, and then move from there. You could also use these ideas for composition, because composers have done these things throughout history. Finally, the part 5 and part 6. Part 5 would be to encourage the students to read music this way and to start writing music that when they start to improvise these ideas, they can reflect and learn to write it so that they can maybe develop ideas through that time spent creating and revising and such. And finally, to find examples of really great musicians who are doing this already. So if you want to be a poet, you should learn some poems. And if you want to be a musician, you should learn some songs and some improvisational solos that great musicians have done. Or if you're a classical musician, if you're playing in a string quartet and you play the viola, you should learn the cello part as as much as you can within the degree of your education and what you've been able to do so far. You could learn that part by ear if possible from a teacher or something. So that was a pretty long answer, but I think by giving you that model of those 6 key elements, it's what I have found to be successful in my current chapter of the research I'm doing to help people wrap their heads around how the relationship between listening and improvising, reading and composing, and then analysis go together for this creative outcome. Both in terms of your intuition. It all has to come back to your intuition, but also in terms of a process and a structure for understanding how this might work in relation to repertoire, not just in relation to quarter notes or let's use this scale. We would want to use the repertoire to contextualize that rather than just begin with that, if that makes sense.
I love the idea. I love the idea of the limiters in a way, and I think, and I'm guilty of this. I was this child in middle school and high school. I got asked a couple days before. I still remember it because it feels traumatic to me. I was asked. I was like 2 days before a jazz competition, and my teacher in middle school said, "I think we need a saxophone solo in this song," and I said, "I don't know how to improvise," and he said, "You'll figure it out by tomorrow." And I like never really got past that, but I think I had such this stigma, and I feel like my own students, when they improvise, their default is, I'm going to put as many notes as I can in as much spot or in as many places as I can. And I think it was Graham Breedlove. He's a trumpet player for the one of the military jazz groups, and I saw him do a master class, and it was fascinating. He talked about teaching kids to improvise over blues changes, and he said the rule is the first time through you can only play the ninth. You can only play this note, and you watch the kids that knew how to improvise go, "Ooh, I can't do that. That's not enough notes." And you watch the kids in the room that didn't know how say, "I don't even know how to do that." And he just demonstrated the idea of holding these notes and just understanding how it feels through changes, and then just adding these tiny little rhythmic elements. And all of a sudden when he goes, "Now you have 2 notes," it was like the coolest thing to watch, because everyone in the room suddenly went, "Now I can play all these things and sustain and play with it." And it was such a cool thing. And even to myself, when I get my kids to improvise, I feel overwhelmed by the amount. And when you say that idea of just rhythmic improvisation or seeing how the rhythm relates within a song, it's a concept that I forget constantly, but it was so helpful to me to get over this hurdle of improvising.
Yeah. The idea of giving the limits. Now, keep in mind that as you do the limits, there has to be awareness in some ways of the feelings that transpire, so the tension and release in more and more scaffolded ways. So, for example, I usually start with the roots of the chords, because a blues, for example, playing a rhythm on those notes, the blues is based on this harmonic idea and related to the text and the form of the blues. Like there's a statement and a repeat of that statement and then some kind of commentary on that. So that form can be taught through different various variations of, let's say, the limits of a rhythm pattern that you repeat on the second time, and then on the third part of the blues that you might change it up a little bit, right? The reason the ninth works on all the chords is because the note is the ninth of the, let's say it's the ninth of an F7 in an F blues. Well, that's the 13th of the 4 chord. And it would sound really nice. And it's, the back to the ninth. And then when you go to the 5 chord, that's of the C chord in the key of F. That's, the ninth of the F chord is the 5th of that. So I know it's a lot of theory, but the point is that those notes actually sound good. You want to make sure it's not by accident that they know that, but it's part of their vocabulary. Mm-hmm. So that's why I kind of start with the roots and work toward what you're talking about, because it's definitely very cool.
And I have to say, also to your final point there, to Marissa's credit too, when the graduate work she did at Eastman, we did a little bit of it with my band as well. And this idea of composing and finally getting to a point where the kids were writing down their own ideas, it was one of the first times I watched the students think about how do I put this rhythmically on a page? And they had these great ideas of, I know how it sounds in my head and I know how I want it to look. I'm just missing that piece to get there. And then the conversation became so much more wholesome because it was not just notes on a page, and it wasn't as artificial feeling, I guess. And it
Yeah.
was so much more intrinsic. And to your point, the internal element of it.
You're making me remember back when I was in 1985, when you were asking that earlier question about what attracted me to all this work. After that summer, one of the key components of the Jump Right In curriculum is this idea of being able to think music, or what's called audiation. But you can think of it as thinking music or feeling it within and hearing the sounds in your head without them being physically present. And that concept was so attractive to me that we all have these conversations in our head musically, or potentially we do. The musicians, I'm saying, that our students should be developing those. And I remember going home after the first summer and having dinner with my band, some friends of mine that I played in a band with, and talking about this very thing. Like, check it out, guys. Here, listen to hear the song in your head. Just hear, I remember going home talking about that. So I completely relate to what you got excited about with that.
I do remember you mentioning audiation at Duquesne, and it's one of, when I have rhythmic issues, especially across a marching band field, again, not to teach just directly in seasons, but when I have issues with any kind of phasing or tearing, I have the kids audiate the song and we do a run through. And sometimes we're just standing in arcs, and I say the majors will conduct and we're going from these 32 measures, but it's audiated, it's just in your head, and you can start to watch them really start to understand and feel the relationship specifically to the beat that they're seeing, and less just trying to focus on their individual part. And it really truly, like you said, it's that idea, or what Marissa said, this idea of, if an administrator comes and they go, they're not doing anything, but the difference is so phenomenally apparent right away.
Yeah, I think Marissa's point is a good one. We need to educate some of the folks that may not really always equate what we do to the curricular subjects that they're more familiar with. So making these analogies to language, helping them understand that music has the same potential. Also, the idea that there are functions in music, that the idea that different rhythms and harmonies participate with other different rhythms and harmonies in a way that help us to express ideas that can't be expressed any other way. It's a unique idea. And as an instrumentalist, one of the biggest things that we can be thinking about is is how to develop these things through singing and movement. Now, that's obviously true when you were in a choir, you're singing and moving. But just because you sing doesn't necessarily mean that you have developed these oral skills. But singing is key to developing oral skills. And what you do is you sing and compare and group and interact and predict, as opposed to, like, I guess the analogy in chorus would be somebody playing your part on the piano and then you just echoing what they did, as compared to you really understanding that part within you, your body. Being able to look at a score and hear it without the sound being present was really attractive to me. So I completely relate to what you're talking about.
One of the things I love doing, and it's half a joke, but it's also a fun little way to see where my kids are, is sometimes I hand out a piece of music and I say, don't play it. And I have them look at it just for a little bit, maybe a minute. And I go, what do you think? And then the kids who have an answer often they're able to kind of look at it, or, sight read in their head, or, they're doing a little bit more than I've had kids go, what do you mean? What do we think? We haven't heard it yet. And it's like, okay, so I know where you are and I know where, it's a fun little.
That's terrific. That's a terrific thing that you could establish the key, even so that they at least have some kind of sense of what the key is and the beat. And then all their responses, someone could remark on the rhythm, or someone could remark on the harmony if they can hear that. Right. Somebody else might say, well, I don't know yet, so it's revealing, isn't it?
It is. It's very revealing. And it's so funny. I think sometimes as they get older, it actually gets worse because they're so used to being in the box And sometimes my sixth graders can look at something and just like right away tell me all about it. And it's very interesting. It's really cool.
Yeah, I think also as people get older, there's a little more of a fear factor
Yeah,
because they've developed a reputation or they've been in situations they don't really want to be put themselves in a situation like that. But as teachers, we need to encourage them to take a risk and try things. I don't mean a huge risk. It's not like you have to, you know, do something dangerous. It's just the idea that you're going to try something and you might make a mistake, but think more like Silicon Valley where they say fail fast so that you learn.
sure.
And it's all about learning. That's really the key for me. I'm motivated by learning. I'm motivated by this idea of improvising. That's really at the center of what I'm interested in, frankly, is how do we learn to improvise and how can I help my own musicianship grow? I was able to find a way to put improvisation and creativity there in the center of my research and work as it informs my listening, as it informs um, my reading, my arranging and composing, my piano playing, and ultimately my teaching. And that's been very rewarding in a big way. It also has been central to developing the relationships that I have, and that's key as well, is how we develop relationships with each other.
Yeah. So we'd like to keep these around 30 minutes, and I know we're over that. I could talk to you all day long.
Nothing wrong with that.
Kev, do you have any other like really pressing questions?
I don't. I mean, I love talking about it, and it's one of those things that I think that doing the stuff that we did, or Marissa did with her graduate work, that I was able to show my band kids and kind of use them as guinea pigs and different things. It was a cool window into it, and it kind of demonstrated the space for it. But I don't actually think I've revisited the topic of it quite as in depth as I have in preparation to have this conversation with you. And it's nice to reflect on the teaching to see, maybe I do more of this than I thought. And then I go, no, I definitely don't do as much of this part of it as I thought I did. And it's cool to reflect on it and just hear the ideas. And I love the idea of the feeling and the expression and bringing it from their own experience.
Right, that's the motivation for me. That the first and foremost, we're musicians that we want to interact as musicians and develop our own musicianship. And as we're doing that, that kind of growth is contagious. So if anybody wants to sort of incorporate some of these ideas, we need to help each other to do that. Professional development is a big deal. I'm happy to work with any musicians, teachers, students around this kind of a thing. And I like to zoom out first. I don't like to immediately go into the details of the names of different kinds of psychology of learning this and that. I like to start with the experience first, just like I'm recommending in music, where we learn songs and we are able to sing a lot of songs in bass lines and maybe an inner voice, where I call it the law of laziness, where you are able to sing a harmony part and you feel the tension and release of just one voice inside. And get that started. People start to comprehend music orally that way and let it grow from there. I think that's how you get people interested, just sort of thinking about that as one dimension of many dimensions in our curriculum. Because I think some people think that you either play by ear or you read, and my point is that you do everything by ear, and reading is a symbol. We learn the symbols of reading because it's reminding us of how musical we are. And that would be on our way to developing real literacy with reading. The whole point, a lot of my research has been around how do we improve reading as we're learning to create, or in the presence of improvisation, do we have a comprehensive curriculum? Those kinds of things. But back to what Marissa was saying earlier, this ability to comprehend music, and it's expressed through our creativity, through our improvisation, through our composition, through our arrangements. So I think that's a really vital component of the profession for what we're doing.
I have just one question to kind of wrap things up. In a little bit, Kevin and I are going to have the opportunity to talk to the NAFME president-elect. And I think I've just assumed that you have certain feelings or whatever, but when the new standards were released and they included creativity, what did that mean to someone like you who's been working on this for your entire career?
That's a very good question. I've done quite a bit with the national organization to the extent that uh, I've done a lot of workshops and things for the national organization. And I'll say that historically in the 90s, in the early 90s, there were the standards that came out. There were 9 content standards. And I had already begun my work. So remember, I was in graduate school in the 80s and the early 90s. And in 94 or 93 or 94, these first standards came out. And the number 3 was improvisation, and number 4, I think, was compose and notate, and or arrange. There were 9 content standards, and it actually worked to help teachers. I was doing a lot of professional development even back in the 90s around these ideas because the national standards came out. Now, when I moved to Connecticut, they already used the model that's the national model now, because the state supervisor of music ended up being a NAFME president, a national organization's president. And so create, perform, respond, connect was something I was already used to in Connecticut. And developing curriculum that embraces this idea of creating has been my life's work, yes, but it's terrific that the national organization has tried to and accomplished putting out there many resources to describe what it is we should be doing when we're teaching music. I like to describe this as how can we turn those national standards into curriculum. Curriculum tells you what to teach, when to teach, why you're teaching it, how to teach it, gives you some idea of the skills and the content areas. It helps you develop assessment ideas to give specific feedback that might be more like the who, teaching to the individual needs of students. And then that would take you back to the what and the when and the why and the how. So that's how sort of I turn these ideas into some kind of a conversation around curriculum. And that's what the most important thing we can do. Curriculum is the lifeblood of what we do. It should embrace this comprehensive music making that we've been discussing.
We're in the middle of a curriculum rewrite, so this is perfect timing for us personally in our
awesome.
district, because this is exciting stuff, I think.
Well, yeah, and to think about the analogy to language again, those are all the 5th grade book report questions, right? Who, what, where, when, why, how, you know. And I'm describing method as who, what, and I'm sorry, let me start over. I'm describing method as what, when, and why. I'm describing teaching techniques as how we do it. And then the who, when I said who, I was still thinking about assessment, like what are the individual needs of our students? So in a concise way, you can think about method as what, when, why, teaching techniques as how, assessment as what are the individual needs, who are our students, and then you might have some specific objectives, certain skills and content areas. Things like verbs, like improvise, compose, read, listen, and what is, the skill needs to be married to a content, like major or minor or Dorian or duple or triple, or some kind of legato or staccato, or is it swing, or is it something with an even feel, or some kind of music in the style of the 18th century, or is it something from the 21st century? All those things go into the lifeblood of curriculum.
I love this. It's like I'm reliving methods class in an hour. It's like all of these ideas are coming back to me and I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to do this tomorrow.
Well, it's good to keep in the forefront of our minds, because that's how we can be communicative with others who are asking questions about our curriculum. But ultimately, the primary reason to do any of this is to improve instruction and make sure our students are getting the best that we can give them. And That's the primary reason to do any kind of assessment anyway, is to improve instruction, to help students learn to the best of their ability. And when we have these conversations, they should spark all kinds of good ideas about the best teaching practice for that.
And I think, I mean, not to completely make everything about the time that we're in any way, but the teaching circumstances we find ourselves in now, almost it's a perfect time to revisit, like Marissa said, like relive these methods courses, because nothing objectively can look like what it did 6 months ago. So it's a perfect time to start to explore these ideas, for sure.
And that's why I would encourage all of us musicians who are teaching, to ask these very simple but very profound questions. You ask the question, well, what am I teaching, and why am I teaching it, and when? When is big for me? When would this be appropriate? Or when am I teaching this song could also be, when am I teaching students how to read, and why am I teaching them to read? How am I teaching them to improvise, or am I teaching them to improvise? How am I teaching them to read in the context of improvising? Those are the questions that will get us, I think, through any situation that involves music teaching and learning, and hopefully transcend to any kind of situation we find ourselves in, because those are core principles.
Yeah. Well, I could keep talking to you forever about this, but I don't want to keep you from your evening either. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Fabulous. I'm sure our listeners will just love to hear all of this again and really latch on to it. So,
well, thank you. I'm honored to be here. I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for inviting me to do this.
Oh, and absolutely. As we start to put this out, and the hope is that it's taken and kind of absorbed by other music professionals. Do you have any upcoming seminars or places that, if people want more and want to find that next step, that they can find you in the coming future?
Yeah, there's always a way to find me at Eastman. On my website, I have a list of things that are coming up next. A lot of it's happening through Zoom these days, but I keep my itinerary both on the Eastman website and on my own personal website, ChristopherAzzara.com. But for example, I'm going to be Zooming at the Berklee College of Music to do a class with them. I'll be doing the BC Music Educators on the West Coast in Canada. BC has a music education conference. I'm going to Zoom a session for them. I am going to be giving a recital at Eastman with my dear friend Mark Kellogg. I'm going to perform on November 1st on his it's a recital that he's organizing, and that's on November 1st. And then I do a little traveling. I'm going to Europe hopefully next year. Hopefully by May of 2021, I'll be able to travel to Germany. I'm supposed to be in Germany. And as things develop, though, where travel is more possible, I'll be sure to post them on the website, and that way people could know what might be available to them. But my life is a combination of playing piano gigs and doing these teaching opportunities. But it's interesting because when I teach, I'm always playing music. You know, it's always about making music. So I feel like that's a great opportunity to interact with folks that way. But I think the best way to summarize it would be to check the website for the future dates, and hopefully as the pandemic may at some point come to an end, there'll be many more live possibilities as well as the online ones.
And we'll make sure for people listening, we'll link in the description for this podcast, we'll link the website so you have easy access to find everything you want to find. So, thank you, Dr. Sheriff, for hanging out with us on a Wednesday. I'm losing track of my days now. It's Wednesday.
Yeah, today's Wednesday. I had a real good time. You may have to edit some of that. We did so much.